We got a special event for you today. So we are doing a deep dive into talking with policy researchers, talking about our research with policymakers. Sorry, not talking about policy researchers, talking to policymakers about our research. A little tongue tied. I got a little COVID hangover still. Um, so the reason I say this is a special edition and we have a special 30 minutes for you here this week is because this is really this is his sweet spot, right? For those of you who haven't figured out yet, Mark's background before working in is a consultant in this space. He spent 10 years on Capitol Hill in the US and was on the other side of having people pitch to him all the time about policy changes. So now he's turned the table and now he does consulting work on helping people do this. So we couldn't ask for a better resource than one of our co-hosts, which is Mark. So he's not a guest, he's a host. And with that, Mark, I hope I lowered the bar so you can smash through it.
Well, thanks. So yeah, I mean, I really it was 20 years, believe it or not. I know
20 years, wow.
just given how young I look, like thinking it was 20 would be like, when did you start? When you were like 15? No, I'm just kidding. But it was 20 years in the House and Senate, and I was chief of staff in the Senate, U.S. Senate, chief of staff in U.S. House during 20 years of work in the House and Senate. And when I left, which was in 2015, I had done about 20 years and decided I wanted to do something different after hitting those goals and just maxing out, loving it. It's like the toughest job you'll ever love. Tagline for a while, but it was a real, and I loved it. I love being in the center of all of this. And when I left, I over certain series of fortunate events, ended up really focusing on helping scientists communicate, scientists, engineers, executives who work in really technical areas, helping them translate the work that they do to their most important stakeholders. So that could be policymakers, of course, then you have funding, right? Why are you communicating? Looking for funding, could be potential investors, again, looking for investment money. It could be during a job interview, right? You're talking to a potential employer, and it can be difficult for scientists who have spent 7, 8, 9, 10 years zeroed in on a specific area of research. How can they make that really relevant and first of all, understood, accessible, interesting, engaging, memorable, and then relevant to
Right.
to a consulting company that is a life sciences consulting firm, and maybe they spent 7 years at University of Chicago working on cancer and optics, right? Using optics to identify cancers more quickly, earlier, I should say. So I love doing this. I do it, through conversation. Like I do it through a keynote, the podcast, newsletter,
So
workshops.
let's say so one of the things you do is workshops, right? Well, I mean, one of the things you do is work with researchers in the university space. You just came back from both Cornell last week, and where were you yesterday?
Yeah, I did Cornell on Friday. I do a guest lecture there in the science policy bootcamp course in the engineering school, which is really cool.
Yep.
Both, just for those keeping score, both Andy and I went to Cornell at different times. I'm of course much older than Andy. Uh, and then,
I bet not.
and then, uh, and then on Monday, I did an in-person workshop, a half-day workshop with the American Institutes for Research, and that was in the Washington D.C. area, and they were a long time client of mine. And in both cases, I was really talking to researchers and how did they get
So what
their
are the
research
top
into the
tips
policy
you give them?
environment.
What are the top, like, give us the top 3 tips.
Yeah, it's funny. Somebody asked yesterday, like, do you have templates for some of this stuff? And I said, well, I'm basically distilling 20 years of blood, sweat, and tears and expertise into 3 hours. Like, isn't that enough of a time
Right.
saver for you? But I do actually have one slide that's very helpful, which I said I shared that with the group. I think the first thing to think about is Why is it different than just talking to any other uh, non-scientist? One of the things that is really maybe a differentiator is that these environments, like whether you're up on Capitol Hill or you're talking to a state legislator or local official, particularly if you're on the federal level, these environments are so intense, and you have kind of an even shorter window than you normally would have to get your point across. Because the people you're talking to have so many responsibilities that are happening simultaneously that it's very easy for them to drift, their attention to drift.
Yep.
So some of the sort of strategies that Andy and I have talked about during the live stream, like, grab attention right away and so forth, are even, doubly important when you're talking there. The other tip is that so as part of that, you really do need to be relatable immediately, by using a descriptor or a tool like a metaphor or a story or something like that right away. I think the big difference, though, is that you have to understand, this is kind of a something that outsiders, or in particular like scientists, may have a challenge with, because your work is intrinsically valuable, right? It's, you're doing it because you can really make a positive difference in the world in many cases, right? I mean, that's why you get up and you go through this process, which can be so challenging, the scientific process. The thing about it, though, from a policymaker's standpoint and from the people who work with that policymaker's standpoint, is they need to know how what you're doing affects the 720,000 people who live in their congressional district or their state. So, talking about climate change and how important it is to take steps to curb, maybe avoid some of the worst consequences of climate change, like that is intrinsically important, but that really isn't enough it's not compelling enough in a policymaking environment, because they need to know, well, look, how does it actually directly impact my people, the people who vote for, could potentially vote for me, support me, because
So
that's their
is
audience.
it, I have a question for you. Is it as cynical as how's this going to help me get reelected?
Well, it's
I mean,
not.
that's like the ultimate cynical, like, okay, let's go all the way there.
Well, it's not quite that, because I want to work on things. Let's sort of say, like, I'm now back in my old world, right?
Right.
In On Capitol Hill, like, we need to be working on things that benefit our people in real ways, and that can be small ways, like on the district office, in particular the local office, not the one in Washington D.C. You're really helping grandma get her social security check, helping grandpa, get that passport that he needs because he's leaving for that once in a lifetime cruise, in a week, and the State Department hasn't gotten back to him yet with his updated passport, can't travel without it. And then on the Washington D.C. level, the federal level, at where we are in D.C., it's, we want to create jobs. We want to improve the lives of the people who live in our district, and that's really the job. It's not necessarily cynical. It's really, that is what the job is,
Yep.
right? You can, and there are different sort of flavors of different elected officials. There are some that are hyper local all the time. They really have a low profile. They're not interested in being on CNN, MSNBC, Fox. They're not interested in that. What they're interested in doing is making sure that there's money for the new port in their district, if they're, live near a waterway or something like that. And that's really what their total focus is. My old boss, who's Ed Markey, who's a now U.S. Senator, he previously was a U.S. Congressman, so a member of the House of Representatives, and I worked for him in both places, the chief of staff in both places. His idea was both. He wanted to be local and also a national figure, so on the
Mm-hmm.
environment and things like that. But the issues that these members work on and are most, have to be focused on, have to have a direct positive impact. The idea is to have a direct positive impact on the people that live in their area of their district or their state.
I want to take a short interruption for a second and say hi, Deborah. I tried to write you a note in the comments, and hi to anyone else out there live with us too.
Yeah.
I invite you to, we can see the comments, but I don't seem to be able to write into the comments. So I'm going to have to check my restream functionality later. I used to be able to, and now I can't. So the tech is always a little bit of a moving target. But I wanted to say hi, acknowledge you're here. Thank you for coming. Thank you to anyone else who is here with us as well.
Thanks for being here.
And please jump into the comments and write questions. Write questions for Mark. Um, I'm gonna kick it off and say, so many of the things that people are interested in working on, their researchers have longer um, have long runways. So, like if we think about climate change, like climate change is not going to make people in your constituency better next week. It's not okay. I want to help grandma get a passport or a social security check. So, if we're working in areas of sustainability, if we're working in areas of um, trying to, I just saw this work that's incredible the other day, right? That there's a malaria drug now coming out
Mhm.
that's helping people not here. Like it was developed in the UK. I'm pretty sure it was the home of it. It's not going to help people in the UK. There's no malaria in the UK. So maybe that's not a good example. But policy changes around things like climate change that aren't making people's life better today. How do you start to talk to people about how do you start to take that focus on my constituency and a shorter time horizon to research, which is by definition a longer time
Mhm.
horizon
Yeah.
and not necessarily local. Sure, it might have local help, but it's not. But most research isn't at the local level. Most research is done at the broader level than that. So how do we overcome those two big, like time and locality? It feels like we're swimming upstream.
Well, I'll give you a specific example that ties both of those together. So, if I came in to an office that represented, say, it was a US Senate office representing Massachusetts. Let's just pick one state at random. Right. Of course, I'm from Massachusetts and I worked for
Me
a
too.
Massachusetts senator. Yeah. So it's not quite at random. However, if I walked in there and said, look, I'm working on this research. It's being done at MIT. So it's in Massachusetts, right? And, we have a lab, we've got about 4 postdocs, 6 PhD students, 2 master's students, and some professional tech workers, and we're working on this, and we think that our ultimate goal is this longer term horizon, but we're working every day to try to make progress towards that goal. Now, if I'm on the receiving end of that, the first thing I hear is the research is being done in Massachusetts. Now, this research has to be done somewhere, right? And so, if we're talking about it being done in any place in the United States, I would encourage researchers who are listening. That's where your immediate focus is who represents those areas, and going to talk to those people. Now, the second piece of it is,
So,
you
the,
know,
so the Canadian context, we might be talking provincially instead of federally.
Sure. Yeah. Who represents those areas? Whose job is it to look out for those areas? And so then the second piece is I just told you, so the second thing is I sort of hear is the jobs, right? There are people who are employed who are working in the district or the state in this case, that I am responsible for looking out for. If I support this research, and this is something I could ask during the discussion, well, do you think you could grow this project? Or actually, they're in here asking our office to help them with a funding request, perhaps that would enable, look, if we could just get XYZ in federal funding, then we could grow this project, employ more people, make much quicker progress towards our goal, which is, say, improving clean water, right?
Yep.
But that's a very compelling argument for me. Now, it doesn't mean I'm looking for the improvement to occur in the next 2 years, even, right? But
So
it
that's
has the
taking a
hallmarks of what I care about.
so that's taking a approach that actually is agnostic to the research project.
Well, the thing is, so let
That's
me, yeah,
that's
well,
the angle of, okay, it's local, it's bringing funding in from other
yeah,
places, it's bringing students here, the students are
mhm,
spending money in local hotels, the students are, we're buying equipment, we're they're going out to eat in restaurant, like it's good local employment.
right. Now, the thing is that's that aspect of it is all what you're talking about. It's really research agnostic. However, if they had said the same thing, and again, taking my old office as an example, my boss was a big supporter. He was the Green New Deal, I think, my former boss, and the Green New Deal author in the Senate with AOC in the House. If somebody said the same exact thing, but said like it's going to help us, with more fossil fuel discovery and all that kind of stuff, then it would be a non-starter. Like we wouldn't support that research. It would be it would be harder to say no to that if it had all these other elements to it. But if it didn't, if it were diametrically opposed on the substance to policies that the boss supported, then we wouldn't support it. A lot of times you can, if it's sort of borderline, then you oftentimes can justify it. But if it were really like blatantly the other side of the issue when it comes to say climate, then we wouldn't be able to support it. And it's even dubious about whether the researchers would come into the office asking for that, because they
So
would understand that.
is this work that researchers should do ahead of time?
The
Like,
yeah the
they should do their due diligence on two things. One is, um, okay, where's the direct economic impact of, um, this work actually happening,
yeah
and then where's the alignment with this particular person's, um, bigger picture goals,
yeah for
and
sure.
trying to align both of those, so some sort of immediate economic impact of, okay, this is good for the local community because it's money in the local community,
Mhm.
with some also, um, okay, this person is pro sustainability or pro clean water, and this is a clean water project, so they're going to be interested in both things.
Yeah. And how this really works, in the real world is that these researchers from a university say wouldn't be on their own because the university no doubt has a government relations department, has a university relations, group. And so oftentimes what happens is, someone from the government relations department at the university and the researcher working on the work both come in. Now, together. And
Mhm.
usually the situation is, it's the government relations person who's sort of the relationship person because that person comes in a lot on all different issues that are being done in the university or things that affect the university. And as a staff person, when I'm listening to the specifics of the research, I want to hear from the researcher. It's much more compelling for me to hear the details, and for my boss would do the sort of the same thing, to hear the details from the researcher. So sometimes I hear researchers say, "You know what? Like it'll be somebody else's job to actually explain it.
Oh,
I
right.
do the science. Somebody else should explain it." I disagree with that 100%. And the reason I do is because there's no one more persuasive than you. The lobbyist, government relations person, that person is not going to know the details. Not that you need to go into the nitty gritty, but the credibility
Right.
and authority that you have as the actual scientist doing this before you even open your mouth is really powerful. And so scientists need to recognize that they have a lot of power just to begin with, a lot of credibility.
Yeah, that's interesting. That like that's where the credibility comes from, right? Is having the researcher in the room.
Yeah,
Deborah, I assume the mental health space, or an advocate for the mental health space, or interested in the mental health space. One of those three things. I'm guessing because she put mental health in the chat here. Um, do you have some insight you can give us about strategies for advocating around mental health that you've
sure.
seen that are effective?
Sure. And, a lot of this begins by asking yourself a simple question like, who on Capitol Hill, which members, which representatives, which senators care about mental health with respect to policy? So in the US, SAMHSA, which of course is an acronym, and within the Department of Health and Human Services, really focuses on this, as do other units, I'm sure. So,
So trying to
you
find people who already care versus trying to make someone care.
it can be both things. That being said, if like, the overarching kind of uh, you have power as a scientist, but you have a lot more power as a constituent, right?
Right.
So I
So
could say, well,
find a champion.
find a champion, right? Say, well, I want to find a champion who represents where the university is or who represents where I live and can vote. Now, the challenge can be, though, what happens if that office does not agree with the policy that I am hoping to advocate for or be a resource for? And so that becomes a bit of a challenge. That's where some of the artistry can come in, because I could say, well, I want to find people who care about it. Well, that's great, but if I'm from Delaware and the real champion that I've identified is from New Jersey, then I'm kind of a non-factor in that New Jersey office. I have no connection to the state. The work's not being done there, for example. I don't live there, and so as a result, I'm not a good messenger for
Can
that.
you can
Sometimes,
you can you twin them? Can you
tell
then
me a little bit more
can
about
you
that.
get your Delaware person who is Delaware and cares for the reason that it's happening in
Mhm.
Delaware, and the New Jersey person who cares about the thing you care about, to do, like, can you get them both in the room and try and convince them both
Mhm.
for different reasons,
Mhm.
or do you really have to find someone that, like, the stars align? Like, you gotta kind of get lucky in some sense of, like, happen to be in the right place and doing the right thing, and this person's supportive, and
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, but I will tell you that that scenario doesn't really happen. However, it's one of the reasons this kind of dynamic, which is not uncommon, is one of the reasons why people build coalitions around issues. Because if I start to put together other groups that feel the same way, outside groups, advocacy groups, groups of universities that feel this way, then either the chances are increased, which they are, and or I do it strategically. So I look at what would be the process of making change in this policy area. Let's just stay with a mental health example. Okay,
right.
well, the Committee of Jurisdiction in the House, the Energy and Commerce Committee, they have jurisdiction over health and environment and some other topics. In the Senate, it's the Senate Commerce Committee. So I say, well, who is on those? Who are members of those committees? Okay, get a sense of who those people are. Then I can go out and look for coalition partners who live or have connections to those areas. I may have some,
And so
but
I may be working in Delaware, but I can partner with a lab in New Jersey,
yeah,
and then
you
the
could, yeah, yeah. I mean, even if it were in a situation where you had to like be doing the research along with. Now you may have collaborators anyway in different
right.
states, which is nice, but you don't have to. You could just have identified stakeholders in those other states, i.e., voters or voters that really care and would be willing to join you in this effort to move this particular policy forward. And you've done it. You've selected these coalition partners very strategically. to address the issue that we were just talking about. What happens if there's a
Right.
mismatch and the person who represents you in the Senate or the House doesn't care about your issue?
It's interesting in that this is all the work that has to be done independent of actually making a good argument.
Right. It's the
Right?
precursor.
This
Yeah,
has nothing to do with actually presenting the argument.
exactly.
This has
Yeah.
to this has to do with trying to figure out the situation and trying to align trying to manufacture the alignment of the stars so that when you do make a good argument, the person's receptive to hearing it.
Yeah. The most artful argument made to a mismatched audience is going nowhere.
I'm going to write that down.
It's just not, there's, it's why should I care about what you're talking about? And it has to go deeper than, it's good for the planet or, I don't have enough time, as someone who's up there, to work on issues that are outside of the boundaries of the area. I mean, which isn't to say they're important. You just need to talk to the people who represent those areas.
Right. Right.
And so we're talking about how to,
So it's like this is either I can imagine that this lands with people out there hearing this, like listening to this conversation.
yeah,
This either lands with an enormously frustrating like, ugh, this is like so hard to do, or um, it lands with a like, oh, okay, I can figure this out. Like
yeah,
that's the piece of the puzzle that I haven't been thinking about before. I've been focused on making the argument and people haven't been responding. And what I need to do is be focused on figuring out who to make that argument to.
yeah. I'll tell you a story that relates to Canada, actually. And before we get to that, it's a real story. Deborah is asking if you could put what I said in the comments, and I was just looking to see if I could do it, but I don't know. I don't think I can.
Is it,
Um,
Deborah, did you mean the quote?
I think it was what you were going to write down. I think
I
that's
wrote
what.
it down. I will add it to the comments after we close the live. I'll go back to it and write it in the comments.
Yeah. So let me
That's the
give
quote
you.
of that's the quote of the day.
Okay, great. I'll give you a real example. Okay. And so when I left Capitol Hill, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I hadn't worked with scientists yet, and I would get calls from connections, family, friends, type of thing, asking me to work on different projects because a typical trajectory for someone with my professional background is to become a lobbyist, and I knew I didn't want to do that. Didn't want to do it full time. Not that there's anything wrong with being a lobbyist. So, because I have worked on some projects, but there are always these friends and family things. So, my first friends and family outreach was the following: I got a call about a gold mine, a gold and silver mine in Canada, actually, that was, focused on excavating, discovering gold and silver deposits. And lo and behold, as they were in the process of doing that, they thought they had identified a large deposit of a rare earth element called scandium. Now, it's not important necessarily what the name of it is, although it was for those interested at home, was called scandium. The fact that it was a rare earth element, though, for those who aren't familiar, rare earth elements, can be used in uh, planes, ships. They can be alloyed with aluminum, less corrosive hulls for ships, faster, lighter, stronger when alloyed with aluminum for purposes of airplanes, and they're also used in electronics. And actually,
So they're
the
worth a lot more than gold or silver.
I don't. Yeah, I don't know what the current per ounce is, but they're very strategic. That's the thing. Actually, the U.S. has what's called a strategic minerals stockpile, and we're supposed
Okay,
to
because
have
they're
like,
because they're defense and military.
yeah, 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 exactly. So we're supposed to have, we mean the U.S. Are supposed to have a ready supply of this. Now, the challenge for the U.S. is that 90% of rare earth elements are located in Russia or China. not our best buds
So
from
this
a
was
strategic
a
standpoint.
big deal, having one just north of the border.
Potentially, our neighbors, our friendly neighbors to the north, of which you are one, Andy, may have stumbled upon this very important deposit of rare earth elements. So when I got the call, could you help us talk to someone on Capitol Hill from the CEO of this mining company in Canada? My first question is, why should anyone in the U.S. Congress care about a Canadian gold mine? Do you have any operations in the United States? And he said, actually, yes, we do. We have a small mine in Pershing County, Nevada. Okay. So I said, okay, let me take a look. Let me figure this. Let me see. Let me do some research and I'll get back to you. And so my first question that I sort of asked myself, the first place I'm going is, who represents Pershing County, Nevada in the United States Congress? And I found who that person was. Of course, there is somebody who does.
Right.
And then the next question is, what does this person care about? What are they? So it ended up that the person who represents Pershing County, Nevada in the US Congress at the time, prior to being elected to the US Congress, had been the head of the Nevada Mining Commission. He also had introduced legislation on rare earth elements in the past. He was a member of the
So he knew
majority
exactly
party.
what was going. He was
Yeah.
he was the perfect fit.
Yes, he was the perfect fit. And so I was able to persuade the CEO to come to Washington. He didn't originally want to. He thought it would be a waste of time. But I said, story for another day. I'll explain how I was able to persuade him pretty quickly that it would be actually worth it. The point was that when we went into that office and the CEO sat down with the member of Congress, it was as if two old friends from college were seeing each other for the first time after a 10-year break. They just were yucking it up. They're both mining nerds and they loved it. They were immersed in it. They were talking about all these terms that I had never even heard of, but they
Yeah.
were loving it because why? I mean, the congressman cares about what he needs to care about everything in his district. This was in his district. And also, we knew, based on research I did, that he was very attuned to minerals and mining. And that's what we wanted to talk about. So it got
Right.
to the point where he was having his staff member write down things that they wanted to do to help us that we hadn't even known to ask. It was like, well, we need to introduce them to this company and this other thing happening. And then I can write a letter and I can do, and it was all of this stuff. And it all came down to effectively identifying who should care about this particular topic.
Yeah. Fascinating. Such a great illustration. And who would have thunk it, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you couldn't write a Hollywood story like that because people wouldn't believe it.
Well, if
But the
I had just,
reality is that's the way sometimes things happen.
even if I had, if talking to somebody who had, you have to have, yeah, you just can't leave it at, well, we have this great mineral we think is so important and it's in Canada. Okay, that's intrinsically important to the US. We have a stockpile and all that. You can't, that's just not enough. Like you really have to start. It might branch out from there. And it did.
Right.
Talking to the Defense Department, talking to some other offices, right? But it has to start with who would really care about
Who would
this
care?
issue.
So let's wrap there. I think
Yep.
that's a good episode. Policy research and policy episode 1. And we'll come back in 2 weeks and continue the story. One question I have on your story is why weren't they talking to the Canadian government? But maybe they were. Why were we trying to send the scandium out of our country? As
Right.
someone
That's a
who's
good
living in
question.
Canada now.
Right. Right.
And then the next part of the story. So it kind of feels like that's step 1, right? Step 1 is identifying the person, and then step 2 is okay. How do we create the argument?
Yeah. The only thing I'll say
So
about the
let's come
yeah.
back.
Yeah. I just want people to feel like the step 1 and step 2 are intertwined in the sense that when you learn about your audience, of course, that informs what you're going to say. Right. We didn't have to
Right,
start with mining 101.
right. It always starts with understanding your audience, doesn't it?
Got to
I love that
connect.
quote. I love that quote about a mismatched audience is going nowhere.
Yeah.
I'm
We're
gonna
both
I'm gonna go from here to LinkedIn. We're gonna end the live, and then I'm gonna go to LinkedIn and add that quote to the comments. Quote of the day, Mark Baer. The
Thank
most
you.
artful argument to a mismatched audience is going nowhere. And that ends episode 1.